Empathy is often praised as one of humanity's greatest strengths, a bridge that allows us to connect, understand, and care for one another. From a young age, many of us are taught that feeling deeply for others is a virtue, something that makes us good, moral, and trustworthy. We celebrate empathy as the foundation of kindness, relationships, and even social progress, yet rarely do we pause to ask what happens when empathy has no limits. What happens when understanding others becomes so intense that it starts to cost us our own peace? This is where empathy's darker side begins to reveal itself, and it often hides behind praise, approval, and the quiet expectation that you should always be there for others. Imagine walking into a room and instantly sensing the emotional weight in the air. You notice tension in a voice, sadness behind a smile, or anger that has not yet been spoken. For highly empathetic people, this is not imagination, but a constant reality. The mind automatically tunes in to emotional cues, even when no one asks it to. Over time, this sensitivity stops being a gift and starts feeling like a burden. You carry emotions that are not yours, yet they feel just as heavy. The line between your inner world and someone else's pain begins to blur. And slowly, without noticing, you start living more in response to others than in alignment with yourself. Many people who experience this empathic overload grow up believing their exhaustion means something is wrong with them. They may label themselves as weak, antisocial, or emotionally unstable. In truth, the problem is not a lack of strength, but an excess of emotional intake without protection. The brain was not designed to constantly absorb the distress of multiple people without rest. When it does, the nervous system remains in a prolonged state of alert. This chronic activation leads to fatigue that sleep alone cannot fix. The body is resting, but the emotional system never truly powers down. One of the key mechanisms behind this experience is emotional contagion. This is the psychological process by which we unconsciously absorb the emotions of those around us. Just as laughter can spread through a crowd, so can anxiety, grief, or anger. For empathetic individuals, this process is amplified. Their brains mirror emotional signals more strongly, making another person's pain feel immediate and personal. Over time, repeated exposure to intense emotions can lead to vicarious trauma. This means you begin to show stress responses similar to someone who directly experienced the trauma, even if you did not. This constant emotional absorption has a name in psychology. It is called compassion fatigue. While often associated with caregivers, therapists, and healthcare workers, it can affect anyone who consistently puts themselves emotionally close to others. Compassion fatigue erodes motivation, dulls joy, and creates a sense of numbness. Ironically, the more you care, the more likely you are to reach a point where you feel you can no longer care at all. This is not because empathy disappears, but because the system becomes overwhelmed. When empathy is unchecked, it consumes the very energy it depends on. Burnout soon follows compassion fatigue when there is no space to recover. Emotional burnout feels different from physical tiredness. It manifests as irritability, withdrawal, cynicism, and a desire to isolate. You may find yourself avoiding people you once loved, not because you stopped caring, but because caring has become painful. Simple interactions begin to feel demanding. Even listening feels like work. At this stage, empathy no longer feels like connection. It feels like exposure without armor. As boundaries erode, decision-making becomes compromised. When you are deeply attuned to others' feelings, it becomes difficult to separate what you want from what others expect. Choices start being filtered through emotional consequences rather than personal values. You may say yes when you mean no, stay silent when you need to speak, or sacrifice your needs to avoid disappointing someone else. Over time, this pattern trains the brain to prioritize external harmony over internal truth. The result is a life shaped by emotional pressure rather than conscious choice. This blurring of boundaries can also distort self-identity. When you spend years responding to others' emotions, you lose clarity about your own. You may struggle to answer simple questions about what you like, want, or need. Your sense of self becomes reactive rather than grounded. You feel real when someone needs you and invisible when they do not. This creates a subtle dependency where your worth becomes tied to emotional usefulness, and that dependency keeps the cycle of empathic overload alive. Highly empathetic people are also more vulnerable to manipulation, even unintentionally. Not everyone who benefits from your empathy is aware of it, but the dynamic still exists. People may overshare, lean heavily, or rely on you for emotional regulation. Because you understand them so well, it becomes harder to pull away. Guilt steps in, whispering that distance equals cruelty. But this guilt is not a moral truth. It is a conditioned response built from years of prioritizing others over yourself. The nervous system plays a crucial role in this process. Empathy activates mirror neurons, which help us understand others by simulating their experiences internally. When this system is constantly engaged, the body remains in a heightened emotional state. Stress hormones like cortisol stay elevated. Over time, this affects sleep, immunity, and mood regulation. You are not just emotionally tired, you are physiologically strained. The body is signaling that something needs to change. Culturally, we often glorify self-sacrificial empathy. We praise those who give endlessly and shame those who pull back. This narrative makes it difficult for empathetic individuals to recognize their limits without feeling selfish. But empathy without boundaries is not sustainable. It turns connection into obligation and care into depletion. True compassion includes self-compassion. Without it, empathy becomes a slow form of self-erasure. It is important to distinguish empathy from responsibility. Understanding someone's pain does not mean you are responsible for fixing it. This distinction is rarely taught, yet it is essential. When you take responsibility for emotions that are not yours, you assume a role you cannot fulfill. No one can regulate the inner world of another person indefinitely. Trying to do so drains your energy and delays their own growth. Empathy should illuminate, not imprison. Many empathetic individuals also struggle with chronic overthinking. After interactions, they replay conversations, analyze tone, and worry about how they were perceived. This mental looping is another sign of blurred boundaries. The mind stays engaged long after the moment has passed. Instead of resting, it continues scanning for emotional threats. Over time, this pattern fuels anxiety and reduces mental clarity. Peace becomes elusive because the mind is always elsewhere. The dark side of empathy also affects relationships. When you consistently absorb others' emotions, resentment can quietly build. You give understanding, but feel unseen. You listen, but feel unheard. This imbalance creates emotional distance, even in close relationships. The irony is painful. The very trait meant to foster connection ends up undermining it. When empathy is one-sided, intimacy suffers. Recognizing empathic overload is the first step toward change. Awareness allows you to see that exhaustion is not a personal failure. It is a signal, a message from your system asking for recalibration. When you name what is happening, you reclaim agency. You stop blaming yourself and start observing patterns. This shift alone can be deeply relieving. Learning to set boundaries does not mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means choosing when and how you engage. Boundaries protect empathy by preventing it from becoming overwhelming. They allow you to be present without being consumed. A boundary can be as simple as limiting emotional exposure, taking breaks, or saying no without explanation. These acts are not selfish. They are necessary. Another key skill is emotional differentiation. This involves consciously separating what you feel from what others feel. Asking yourself simple questions can help. Is this emotion mine? Did it exist before this interaction? Does it belong to someone else? Over time, this practice strengthens your internal clarity. You remain empathetic without losing yourself in the process. Empathy also becomes healthier when paired with perspective. Not every emotion requires action. Not every pain requires intervention. Sometimes the most compassionate response is presence without absorption, listening without merging, caring without carrying. This balance transforms empathy from a burden into a choice that serves both you and others. It is also important to examine why some people develop heightened empathy. Often, it is rooted in early experiences where emotional attunement was necessary for safety or approval. Understanding this origin helps release shame. Your empathy was once adaptive. It helped you navigate complex emotional environments. But adaptation does not mean permanence. You are allowed to evolve. As you learn to regulate empathy, decision-making becomes clearer. Choices are no longer clouded by fear of emotional fallout. You begin acting from values rather than reactions. This clarity restores confidence and reduces inner conflict. You feel grounded instead of pulled in multiple directions. Life becomes quieter, not because you care less, but because you are no longer carrying what was never yours. Empathy, when balanced, becomes a powerful tool rather than a heavy weight. It allows connection without collapse, understanding without exhaustion, compassion without self-loss. The dark side of empathy is not a reason to reject it, but a reason to refine it. When you respect your limits, empathy becomes sustainable. Ultimately, the goal is not to shut down or harden your heart, it is to protect it, to recognize that your sensitivity is valuable, but only when it exists alongside boundaries and self-awareness. When empathy is conscious rather than compulsive, it enriches life instead of draining it. And in that balance, connection becomes a source of strength rather than a silent burden.